Okay, well, we're kind of at that stage of the course where I have given you, I've taught you as much as mainstream philosophy of mind as I can bear. But anyway, you should know about that, about functionalism and strong AI and weak AI and computationalism of various kinds and behaviorism and type and token. But I really think that that's the wrong way to go about it. We have to think of the brain as a biological organ like any other, and we have to think of consciousness and intentionality as higher level features of the brain caused by lower level processes, in the same way that digestion is a higher level feature of the digestive tract and is caused by a lot of lower level processes. It's irreducible for an essentially trivial reason, namely it's got a first person ontology, so you can't reduce it to something with a third person ontology. But Cartesianism dies hard, and ironically, one of the manifestations of Cartesianism is the idea that the mind is a computer program. It's not a part of the physical world. It's something formal and abstract. So people who pretend to be anti-Cartesians defend exactly that view. Dan Dennett, for example, I'm quoting him more or less verbatim when he says the mind is something formal and abstract. Descartes would know exactly what he had in mind. Okay, now what then are the prospects? Supposing I'm right, what are the prospects for cognitive science? Well, as I've mentioned several times, cognitive science has moved away from a computational paradigm to a paradigm of cognitive neuroscience. And I think that's right. I think that's exactly the right way to go. We will understand how the mind works in much more detail when we understand how the brain works. But that's a long project. That's not something that's going to be achieved instantly. It's going to take a long time because the brain has, well, who knows? But by current estimates, has 100 billion neurons. It keeps growing. When I was a kid, they used to say the brain has 1 billion neurons, but then it keeps swelling. Then it went to 10 billion. Now it's 100 billion, so I don't know what the upper limit is going to be. But anyway, it's a lot of neurons. And the functional unit is a synapse, and I don't know how to say how many synapses. Zillions, I guess, is the technical term, but it doesn't sound very scientific. Okay, so what are the prospects for cognitive science? Well, I think we're making progress in cognitive neuroscience. The difficulty is, how do you do it? What's the research technique? And existing research techniques, as they say, tend to be invasive. That means you have to kill the animal in order to do the research, or you have to make a mess out of the animal's brain. So the temptation is always to think, well, there's going to be this gap between the level of common sense intentionality, what some people call folk psychology, and the level of neurophysiology. It'd be nice if we could find a way to study the mind, a systematic, scientific way to study the mind, which wasn't common sense intentionality and wasn't neurobiology, simply because the neurobiology is too hard, we don't know enough, we seem to be too far away from getting an understanding. And I mentioned various gap fillers last time, and the one that we ended on, and I want to say more about that, is sociobiology. Maybe we ought to take Darwinian models of explanation more seriously than we have. Now, I want to say a little bit about the Darwinian model of explanation because it is a very important scientific revolution, and I want you to understand it. Often, advances in knowledge come not just from getting new explanations, but getting a new kind of explanation, a new form of explanation. And that's what Darwin did. And I want to explain that so you understand it perfectly. If you take pre-Darwinian biology, the temptation was to think you could only explain biological phenomena using an intentionalistic model of explanation. What purpose did the biological trait serve? What function did it serve? What goal did it serve? And you will recognize all of those as intentionality. And the jargon at the time, and it's still a current jargon, is to say that the biology before Darwin was teleological. Teleological, meaning it has to do with purpose or goals. So, for example, if you ask yourself, why does the plant turn its leaf toward the sun? And if you watch sunflowers, they will follow the sun in the course of the... I'm not suggesting you should, but if you put a slow camera on them, you can see that it turns toward the sun. The leaves turn toward the sun or other source of light. Why? Well, before Darwin, it's tempting to say things like, well, that way it gets more light, and that enables it to survive, so it does that in order to survive. Why does the fish have the shape that it does? Well, it's better able to swim in water if it's shaped like a fish and not like a brick. So it has the shape that it does in order to survive. Now, what Darwin did was get rid of teleology in explaining the origin of species. Both of those explanations, the plant turns its leaf toward the sun in order to survive, the fish has the shape that it does in order to survive, both of those explanations cite a goal, survival, and then the phenotype functions to serve the goal. So we're to think of the explanation of the phenotype as essentially intentionalistic. The animal has that feature in order to survive. Now, what Darwin did was turn that explanation upside down by introducing two different levels of explanation. If you ask yourself, why does the plant turn its leaf toward the sun? There's a purely mechanical, biochemical explanation, and that is that the plant secretes a growth hormone, it's called auxin, and variable secretions of auxin in response to different light intensities mechanically turn the leaf toward the sun. There's no intentionality at all. It's strictly mechanical. But now comes the second level of explanation, and that is plants that do that are more likely to survive than plants that don't. So watch what happened. The original teleological explanation was replaced by two levels of explanation. There was a causal explanation, which was auxin, and then there was a so-called functional explanation, which explains the function of the phenotype in the survival of the plant, and that says plants that do that will survive over the long haul. That is, we have introduced a temporal element. We've introduced what they call a diachronic element, where we're interested in how it works over long periods of history. So notice, instead of saying the plant turns its leaf toward the sun because it wants to survive, and that enables it to survive, we say the plant turns its leaf toward the sun because of a variable secretion of a growth hormone, auxin. And now comes the survival. Plants that do that are more likely to survive over the long haul than plants that don't. Notice that survival still functions in the explanation, but it's no longer a goal that the plant is trying to attain. It's just something that happens. So we've inverted the conditional. Instead of saying the plant turns its leaves toward the sun in order to survive, we just say plants that turn their leaves toward the sun are more likely to survive than plants that don't. And this particular growth hormone will cause that. It will cause it to be the case that the plant turns its leaves toward the sun. Now that is a stunning intellectual revolution, because nature has the appearance of intentionality. It looks like no natural processes could have designed the eyeball. It had to have been designed by some designer. And this was a traditional argument for the existence of God. As Leibniz said, if you go out in the field and you find a watch, you've got to suppose there was a watchmaker. It couldn't just happen. Now what Darwin is saying is, think of billions of years and it can just happen. But in order to account for its happening, you have to have two different levels of explanation. You have to have a causal level of explanation that explains how certain mechanisms function in the behavior of the organism. And then you have to have a functional level of explanation that explains how, over the long haul, inclusive fitness, the chances that that type of organism will survive are increased by the presence of that type of that particular phenotype. Now that is a remarkable intellectual revolution, and it's one of the since the 17th century there have been a very small number of really important scientific revolutions, and that was one of them, was the Darwinian revolution that drove teleology, that drove goal-directedness out of the origin of species. And a lot of people have thought, let's apply that to the study of human behavior. Let us see human behavior as itself a phenotype that has a functional explanation in terms of the survival of the species, and has a causal explanation in terms of the mechanisms that produce the operation of that particular phenotype. It's a terrific idea. I think that it's very limited in what you can do with it, and I'm now going to show you some of the limitations. But it's important to see that in the original explanation, where you think of organisms are trying to survive, the plant wants to survive, so it does this thing in order to survive, we got rid of that. The plant doesn't have any desires at all. Rather, the plant just has a mechanical procedure that enables its leaf to turn toward the sun. And here's where survival comes. Plants that do that are more likely to survive than plants that don't. So survival still functions, but it is not a goal. It's just something that happens over long periods of evolutionary time. Okay, now can we apply... Oh, by the way, I use their jargon. Their jargon makes a distinction between the causal and the functional. But of course, they're both causal. I mean, the functional is also causal. It just has to do with the causal mechanisms that perform the function of enabling the species to survive over many generations. Okay, now I'm going to apply this to the study of human behavior. Can we do this? Can we do this type of explanation for the study of human behavior? I think it's very limited what you can do with it, but you can do some things with it. So let's see how far it'll go. Now, first of all, I want to stop for questions, because this is a very important scientific revolution that I'm describing to you. The substitution of intentionalistic teleological explanations with the two-level explanation, two causal levels, the functional level and the mechanistic or causal level. Let's take questions about that. Yeah?
So, this may be addressed a bit, but can someone argue that the teleological explanations are ontologically reducible to the causal and the functional?
Well, the idea was this, that the teleological explanation, when it actually works, why was there so much movement to California after the end of the Second World War? And there is a teleological explanation. People thought they'd have a better life in California. That was that's a teleological or intentionalistic explanation that actually works. Now, of course, we suppose, as anti-dualists, as in some sense materialists, that there must be some neurobiological explanation of their desires. The point, however, is that in that explanation, I mean, it is a remarkable phenomenon. Greatest migration in human history was the migration of the people in the rest of the United States to California after the end of the Second World War. They all jumped in their station wagons and made their way to San Diego or God knows where, and here we are. I mean, we're, I guess, in some sense, their descendants. Okay, that's a teleological explanation that works. And we suppose it's grounded in neurobiology. But now here's the point. You can't get rid of the intentionality in that explanation. Now what Darwin did was get rid of the intentionality in the explanation that says the plant turns its leaf toward the sun in order to survive, or because it has the purpose of survival, or because it wants to survive. He got rid of that. That's just gone. Now, some people have supposed, well, let's get rid of all intentionality. And there is, as you know, there is a movement that says intentionality is just an illusion. There are no such things as purposes. We're going to get rid of it altogether. That doesn't work. There are people who believe that. Dan Dennett believes that. And I don't know if he has any followers still, but anyway, there are some people who think there's no teleological explanation at all, no intentionalistic explanation. We know that's false. I will demonstrate its falsity. I'm thirsty. There isn't any question that my thirst caused my drinking. Yes, but how about the fact that the thirst was grounded in variable secretions of angiotensin II that struck the hypothalamus? And then I tell you the whole damn story about thirst. Quite right. The thirst was itself grounded in the plumbing, all the same. Grounded in the plumbing or not, thirst functions causally. Okay, but anyway, it's a good question, and the answer is Darwin got rid of teleology altogether, got rid of intentionality altogether, but there are lots of explanations where you can't get rid of it. It continues to function even though the intentionality itself has an explanation. Any other questions before we apply this to human behavior? Okay, now, applied to human behavior, here's how it's supposed to work. We discover that just as there are apparent purposes in the plant turning its leaf toward the sun, so there are certain social norms, social patterns of behavior that appear to be similarly teleological. But what we're going to do in the case of those norms of behavior is do exactly the move on them that we did on the plants turning its leaf toward the sun. We're going to substitute a functional explanation and a causal explanation for the teleological explanation. Everybody's got it. That's the project. Okay. So what we got to do are find universal phenotypes that we can explain in the way that we explain the behavior of the plant or the shape of the fish. Now, the favorite example in the literature was the incest taboo. Why? Because it is a cultural universal. All tribes have an incest taboo. All tribes forbid incest. Now, immediately, those of you who have had any anthropology will scream, but incest means different things in different cultures. In some cultures, it's okay to marry your cousin. In others, it isn't. And I think those guys would agree with that there are variations on the incest taboo. All the same, there's a certain core incest taboo that is in all cultures. And the core incest taboo says you cannot have brother-sister sex, you can't have mother-son sex, and you cannot have father-daughter sex. Now, if you give a teleological explanation, the reason for that is it's evil. And all cultures recognize that this is evil, so they forbid it. Okay, that is not a scientific explanation. What the sociobiologist is going to do is find a causal explanation and a functional explanation. Now, the causal explanation I started to explain to you last time. It's what I call the kibbutz syndrome. That's just my jargon for it. But the way it goes is this. If you study groups of small children who grow up together, as they grow up together in a communal nursery, they don't have any sexual desire for each other when they reach adolescence. So the boys and girls in the kibbutz meets eshkoliot want nothing to do with the other boys and girls in Meets Eshkoliot. It's the boys and girls in the kibbutz on the other side of the mountain, in kibbutz Habonim. And Meets Eshkoliot, boys and girls, I don't know any Hebrew. Meets Eshkoliot just means grapefruit juice. It's the only Hebrew I learned when I was in Israel. Anyway, it's the boys and girls on the other side of the mountain. Those are more attractive. Okay. So the functional explanation of the incest taboo is that it's just unattractive to have sex with somebody you grew up with. And that's the functional explanation. That's the causal, that's the causal explanation. Now the functional explanation is this. Why do we have biparental reproduction at all? And as I mentioned last time, some of you are all familiar with, biparental reproduction is an enormous hassle in all sorts of ways that I need not enumerate to this class. Okay, but now surely it would be much more efficient not to have biparental reproduction, to have sensible reproduction the way amoebas do it. I could just be walking along the street and suddenly there'd be a whole bunch of little Searles, right? Instead of, or big Searles, instead of doing it in the inefficient way that we've all been structured to do it. All right, now here comes the functional explanation. The causal explanation is you don't have sexual desire for people that you grew up with. The functional explanation is biparental reproduction is better because you mix the genes. You get a mixing of the genes and that produces a better phenotype. But you lose the advantage of biparental reproduction if you have sex with your sister or your mother or your brother or your father, because you're no longer mixing the genes. It's the same genes over and over, and that means, for example, that you're going to have a lot of recessive genes coming out in the phenotypes, as the Romanovs had hemophilia because they were busy marrying each other. Okay, and in cases where you do get intermarriage within the family, as with certain aristocratic families in Europe, or with the pharaohs, where you're forced to marry your sister or your brother because nobody else is good for you, then you do get an evolutionary disadvantage because the recessive genes tend to come out more often with intermarriage than they do otherwise. Okay, now look, isn't this a beautiful explanation? We have a functional explanation, just like the plant turning its leaf toward the sun. The species is more likely to survive if you don't have incest. And furthermore, you have a mechanical or causal explanation. You lose sexual desire for people you grew up with. Now, the guy who invented all this, Ed Wilson, gave this as his favorite example of sociobiology, and I debated him once in a lecture in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and he said, we have discovered scientifically why incest is evil. Incest is evil because it violates this pattern of explanation. And I pointed out to him, you didn't discover why incest was evil. Even if everything you say is true, there'd be nothing wrong with a man who rapes his daughter, provided he uses precautions. The only thing that you have shown is there's an evolutionary disadvantage to having reproduction, not sex, but reproduction within the same family. Okay, so what's wrong with the explanation? Does everybody get it? I mean, I went through it rapidly, but I don't think it's intellectually all that difficult. Yes. To people we grew up with.
Seems like a difference in the causal there.
Yeah, well, I think you're right, and let me spell it out. I had many objections to Wilson, but one obvious objection to this is if the story were true, you wouldn't need a prohibition. That is, if in fact everybody found it disgusting to have sex, or at least unattractive to have sex with members of their own family, you wouldn't need a prohibition. What they explain is not a prohibition, but an inhibition. supposing their story is right, then the fact that you're less inclined to find people that you grew up with in an immediate family environment, that you're less inclined to find them attractive, that would be explained by this mechanical feature that they claim to have discovered. But it does not explain why there is a universal prohibition. So far, we have no explanation of the moral prohibition that follows. Now, there are other standard explanations. The Freudian explanation is that it's destructive of the family. It would be very destructive of the family to allow incest within the family. I don't have any opinions about the incest taboo. What I'm interested in is, does it give us a model for explaining phenotypes on a sociobiological basis, using the Darwinian pattern of substituting for teleology, substituting a causal level and a functional level. Now, Wilson also claims to be able to explain certain common assumptions that we make about sexual behavior. It is commonly assumed that men seek a larger number of sexual partners than women do, that the males of our species are more sexually active than the females. And the explanation is supposed to be that the females have a very limited number of eggs, where the men have lots of sperm. So it's in the female's interest, genetically speaking, to try to find someone who will help her to raise the infant to adulthood, whereas it's in the male's interest, genetically speaking. Now, again, I use the teleological vocabulary, but that's just a metaphor. We're talking about what is more likely to survive. We're talking about the functional explanation. It's in the male's interest to spread his sperm as widely as he can, thus increasing the probability that his sperm will continue to be reproduced in the next generation. Okay, so that is sociobiology, and those are the models. Now, there are several things wrong with it, it seems to me. First of all, I've already said what's wrong, or one of the crucial things that's wrong with the explanation of the incest taboo. Namely, it does not explain the prohibition. At the most it could account for would be an inhibition, and what we want to know is, how do you get from the inhibition to the prohibition? And generally it's the case that where you have an inhibition, you don't need a prohibition. Why is it, for example, that there's no universal prohibition against eating mud, right? I'm sure there would be an evolutionary disadvantage if we all went out and ate as much mud as we possibly could. The answer is, you don't need a prohibition. Nobody thinks mud eating is fun. I mean, you have, well, I won't go into detail, okay? Fill in your own details here. Where you have an inhibition, we just find mud eating unattractive, so you don't need a prohibition. Now, if sex among members of the same family were unattractive, you wouldn't need a prohibition. I think, in fact, in certain cultures, incest is probably more common than we tend to realize in certain rural parts of the South. And again, this is strictly folk sociology on my part. I have not done a study of Kentucky hillbillies, but it seems to me quite reasonable to suppose that in fact the inhibition does not function universally. That in fact there are cases of cultures where incest is more common than in other cultures. Yes?
Statistically, it's in the Northeast.
It's in the Northeast?
And Vermont.
Maine and Vermont. Okay, the hillbillies moved up there when I wasn't looking. Okay, all right, there's something else that's worrisome about this, and that is it tends to seek an ex post facto explanation of a stereotype. And you have the feeling, look, suppose the stereotype were different. I mean, our stereotype is there are all these guys going out looking for as many girls as they can, and there are all these girls being very cautious looking for Mr. Right, or whatever he's called nowadays. Okay, that's the stereotype. Now we explain that. But suppose the stereotype were exactly the other way around. You think, well, these girls, you got to watch out. They're pretty hungry. And the guys, they're pretty cautious. Suppose that were the stereotype. Then we could use the same explanation. We'd say, well, the girls, you see, they got a limited number of eggs, and they need to make sure sure those eggs get fertilized. Whereas with the case with the guys, they got lots of sperm, so what they got to do is make sure that they fertilize it with the right female. Okay, I don't think that's correct. What I'm trying to tell you is there's something ad hoc about the pattern of explanation. However, having said that, I think there is something right about it. I think that the explanation of the vastly different nature of the behavior, regardless of how it's shaped culturally, that goes with having both an X and a Y chromosome and having two X chromosomes probably has some explanation like that. Okay, the real objection to sociobiology I haven't said yet, and that's this. What we're trying to explain are patterns of human behavior. Now, the difficulty with a Darwinian model is that there are too many patterns within the same model. The human gene pool has not changed in the past 30,000 years. Now think of all the different societies, all the different forms of democracy, fascism, communism, socialism, all the different forms of hunter-gatherer and urban societies. All of those have to be consistent with the same gene pool. Now, I got that figure 30,000 years from Sherry Washburn, who was a famous anthropologist here. Suppose he's wrong by a factor of 10. Suppose it's in the past 3,000 years. Well, think of the enormous variations in human behavior over the past 3,000 years. And then it turns out that the Darwinian model of explanation is really too crude to explain all of the things we need explaining. However, there are certain things that do seem to me that probably have a genetic basis. And let me mention those, and then I'll stop for questions. In the 1960s, before any of you were born, there were all sorts of perfectly dreadful political and social movements. Incidentally, that's going to be a sentimentalization of the 60s. It's already gone on. It was a perfectly dreadful period, just awful. But among its manifestations was the urge to get away from it all, to go out in the woods and have a kind of pure society. And so there were a lot of communities called communes that grew up in the California hills. Now, somebody did a study. All of them died, incidentally. They all failed. I don't know if any of them still survived. But somebody did a study of the communes, and they found that all of those that survived had a single common feature. All of the communes that survived over a period of many years had a single common feature. And that was they all had a single dominant male. It's as if somehow or other they had reverted to a hunter-gatherer form of existence, where there was a single chief who told everybody else what to do. So, and there must be, I mean, one thinks at least, there probably is some sort of biological basis for that. That the dominant male, that this phenotype came out in this communal situation. Now, another phenomenon that fascinates me is this. All the philosophers I know, including myself, think that some kind of liberal democracy is the best social organization for human societies. It's very hard nowadays to find any convincing argument against, roughly speaking, liberal democracy. By that I mean you have representative government, you have guarantees of human rights, there's a chapter in my latest book about why we have human rights. The book's called Making the Social World. So something like liberal democracy seems to me the most desirable form of social organization and government. Now here's the problem for us. How come it's so rare? How come over the history of the world liberal democracy isn't the norm? How come it is extremely rare to have the kind of egalitarian equality society with universally recognized human rights that we think is obviously philosophically desirable? And here's one hypothesis to explain why it's so rare, and that is certain sorts of domination urges are biologically built into us. Certain sorts of urges whereby certain people have power over others, have more power than the other members of the community, and the others recognize that power, that's common and biologically based. Now, there's a common mistake everybody makes, and I don't want you to make it, and that's this. People suppose if it's genetically based, you can't do anything about it. You just have to live with it. That's not true. We're busy overcoming genetics all the time. Adolescent boys, as far as I can tell, have a genetic urge to beat up on other adolescent boys. But that doesn't mean we just have to put up with it. Oh, well, it's just the way they are. Boys will be boys. No, we don't allow it. We put a stop to it. So there are all kinds of things that are genetically based that we can alter or put a stop to. But it ought to bother people like me who think that liberal democracy is obviously the best form of organizing societies. It ought to bother us that it's very rare, that it's not at all common, and to get it implemented, as we're now trying to do all over North Africa, as we're now trying to do all over North Africa and the Middle East, that is not a trivial task. Okay, so I'm just going to summarize this and then we'll take questions. I think that the sociobiology urge to feel, well, we can get a scientific account that's in here that will identify certain common human traits, and we will use a Darwinian mode of explanation to account for that. That is, we will do the shift that Darwin gave us, where the teleological explanation, where we try to explain the incest taboo, we try to explain that teleologically or intentionalistically, we'll substitute for that a causal level of explanation and a functional level of explanation, and that will work for, in general, for the analysis of society, morality, and all sorts of other traditional philosophical worries. I think that there are very strong limits on what you can do with that, simply because there's so much variety within the common gene pool. Within a common genetic structure, there are enormous varieties in morality, social organizations, ways of regulating behavior among the sexes, organizing family life, educating the young, and so on. So it is a useful tool to think sociobiologically, and I do, in fact, in many ways, think sociobiologically, but it's very limited. You can't do enough with it. Okay, I want to stop and take questions now about that. Does everybody understand that? The standard book on this is Ed Wilson's book called Sociobiology and New Synthesis, and that provoked a lot of other books. One was by a guy named Barash, and I forget the title of his, but I debated all of these guys. I was annoyed. I debated Wilson in Ann Arbor, and I flew all the way to Ann Arbor, and we had a huge debate. And I didn't have any doubts about who won the debate. And then I found out they paid him 20 times as much money as they paid me. I was a little annoyed at that. He got $10,000 and I got $500. Well, anyway, minor complaints, okay? But that was one thing that stuck in my mind. Questions about sociobiology? All right, let's go. Yes.
It strikes me that your democracy, lack of democracy, universal democracy, is
Yeah.
a counterexample. I mean, it strengthens the Wilson account, and it's a counterexample to your doubts.
Yes. No, it does. Here is the Wilson account. Democracy may be morally valuable to people, but it's probably counter-biological. That our natural biological urge is hierarchical. And I think there's probably something depressingly right about that. Think of your high school experiences. I'm sure yours can't have been as horrible as mine were, but one of the things that struck me in high school was its lack of democratic egalitarianism. There's a natural kind of pecking order, worse among girls than among boys, incidentally. But still, there's a natural kind of hierarchical order that develops in these in subcultures, subgroups like high school classes, and it may well be that there is an urge against equality, an urge against egalitarianism, an urge for some sort of hierarchical structuring where certain people have more status than other people, and this certainly is true of primates. In primates, there's the alpha male and the alpha female, and though the alpha male has to constantly be fighting for his position as alpha male, and he has allies among other alpha males. I went to visit the big primate lab in Leipzig. It's run by Mike Tomasello, who's an American, but he's head of this huge lab in Leipzig. And the primates are absolutely fascinating. And they are, I mean, one of the reasons they're fascinating is they are, so to speak, too human. But one of the things that is characteristic about them is a pecking order, an order of dominance. There's an order of the alpha male dominates the others, and then the young ones are constantly competing with the alpha male, and eventually one alpha male is overthrown by another by another primate who then becomes alpha male. Now there's an interesting point, and that is, I think a lot of people suppose that the reason rape is uncommon among human beings is that we have social prohibitions. It's the law that prevents the males from raping the females. But I think that's probably not right. Rape is uncommon among primates. They don't have laws, and the males are much bigger than the females. But rape is very uncommon among primates. It's not unknown, but it's certainly extremely uncommon. So it may be that there are all sorts of psychological prohibitions or psychological limitations against the male taking advantage of the female's physical weakness, and it isn't just, there's more involved than just society. Now later on, when we talk about language, I want to show you how once you got language, you get all kinds of things that you don't have in pre-linguistic communities. So the alpha male has to get up every day and fight for his position as alpha male. Barack Obama doesn't have to do that. He doesn't have to get up in the morning and think, which of these bastards do I have to arm wrestle with today to keep my job as president? He doesn't. That's been settled. Okay, now how is it settled? Well, that's a remarkable power of human language. We create permanent status functions, as I call them. However, I'm not there yet. I'm working up to that. Okay, right now then, we're at the question, is there forms of explanation which are not intentionalistic but not neurobiological, and will they give us a basis for cognitive science? The most famous form, and the one that still survives to some extent, though it's much less powerful than it was, is the computational model. The idea is that in here, in the gap, there is the computer program. And the beauty of the computational model is you don't have to know how the neurobiology works. You don't have to know how the brain works in order to do a science of the mind. I think that is a profound mistake, but that is one of the attractions of the computational model of the mind. It seems to give us a cognitive science which is independent of neurobiology. And indeed, in the early days of cognitive science, the line was, the brain doesn't matter. The brain just happens to be the stuff we're implemented in. And when I got interested in the brain, I started reading neurobiology books. Perfectly good friends of mine would say, why are you wasting your time on the brain? That's just the plumbing, Okay, we just happen to be implemented in this kind of plumbing, but any implementation will do. What matters for a serious science of cognition is the level of the program. Now, a variation of that, and this is still common, is to suppose, well, even if the rules that we discover are not computational rules, all the same, they are unconscious rules. And the way we'll explain human cognition is by unconscious rule following. And I now want to explore that idea, and what I'm going to explain to you in the next few minutes is what I call a connection principle. And the connection principle says you don't have a well-defined notion of the unconscious except in terms of that which is accessible in principle to consciousness. We understand unconscious mental states on the model of conscious mental states. Now, when I published this, it's in the Rediscovery. When I published the claim that the consciousness and the unconscious are connected because you understand an unconscious mental state as mental, precisely to the extent that you see it as the kind of thing that could be conscious. There were a lot of attacks on that, and maybe I should put some of those on B-Space. There was an article by Jerry Fodor and Ernie Lepore attacking that. There were lots of other articles, but that was one of the longest and most thoughtful. Anyway, I'm now going to develop the argument for the connection principle. Before I do it, though, I want to say a little bit about the attitude that people have toward consciousness. Consciousness has always been an embarrassment to science. Partly, this is for Cartesian reasons. If you believe in Descartes, consciousness is out of the bounds for science. You can't have a science of consciousness because it's not part of the physical world. It's not part of the world that science can describe. There's no such thing on the Cartesian view as a science of the soul. There's a science that deals with the physical world. Okay, now that sort of Cartesian, I think, is rare. There aren't many such people around, but there's still a resistance to having scientific explanations that appeal to consciousness. And there's a certain irony because there was a time when people thought consciousness is not problematic, it's the physical world that's problematic, and then in the past 150 years that got turned upside down, and people thought, well, you can't really appeal to consciousness, it's too mysterious, it's not a part of the scientific world. That also faded out, and people began to recognize that we can have a science of consciousness. But in the past couple of decades, there is an interesting set of attacks on that at some point I would like to discuss. And these are the attacks that say, look, recent neurobiological research shows that consciousness doesn't function causally in our behavior. It just goes along for the ride. And there are various arguments for this, but probably the most famous is by Ben Libet. Now, Libet, I've mentioned this before, but I'm going to remind you of it. Libet was a neurobiologist at San Francisco, and he followed up some research done by two Germans, Deka and Kornhuber. And what they found was this. If you tell a guy, you tell your subject, every so often you're going to push a button, or in some trivial physical task like that. Every so often you're going to push a button. But when you finally decided to do it, at the moment you're going to initiate the action, look at the clock and see where the second hand is, and then report where it was when you actually had the onset of your intention to push the button, what I would call the intention in action to push the button. And what they found was that quite a long time, about 300 milliseconds before the guy was aware of his intention to push the button, there was an increased brain activity. There was an increased brain activity in the supplementary motor area. So what Libet concluded, I think it's a bit swift, but what he concluded is, look, you don't really make up your mind to push the button. Your brain decides to push the button, and you become aware of that after the brain has already decided. So consciousness can go along for the ride, and maybe it can veto and guide the behavior, but the actual initiation of the behavior is done by brain processes that are totally unconscious. Okay, I think that's a confusion, but I'm not going to expose that. What I'm going to do this morning, now in the time that's left to us, is explain what I call the connection principle. And the connection principle says we only understand an unconscious mental state. We understand what it is for a state to be unconscious only to the extent that we understand that state as the kind of thing that could be conscious. Even if you can't be conscious of it because of forgetfulness or brain damage or repression, all the same, it is the kind of thing that could be conscious. Let me give you some examples. When I drove to the campus this morning, I followed the rule, drive on the right-hand side of the road. I never gave it a thought. At no point. I was busy thinking about Wilson and sociobiology and sex relations among primates and the incest taboo. I was not thinking about how you're supposed to drive on the right-hand side of the road. I followed that rule unconsciously. All the same, though, there's no question that I did follow that rule. There are other rules I could have followed. If I'd been driving in England, I would have followed the rule, drive on the left. But I followed the rule unconsciously, drive on the right. We understand that perfectly because we understand that what it is to follow the rule consciously. And to follow the rule unconsciously is to be in a situation, what? Where the rule continues to function causally by way of intentional causation, even though you're not thinking about it then and there. You could be thinking about it. You just don't happen to be thinking about it then and there. Okay, now what happened in cognitive science, and linguistics especially, is that a whole lot of rules were postulated that aren't even the kind of thing that the agent could become conscious of. And let me give you some famous examples of these. There are a series of illusions that are studied in vision science. And one of the most famous of these is the Ponzo Illusion. And a Ponzo Illusion was discovered by an Italian psychologist, and guess what his name was? Ponzo. And Ponzo said, notice that you will tend to see, supposing I drew it right, you'll tend to see this line as longer than that line, even though they have the same length. Why? Well, the standard explanation was you're following two rules and making inferences. First of all, you follow the rule that says if you see converging lines toward the top, see the top as further away than the bottom. Convergence implies distance. And then the second rule is if you have the same stimulus to the retina by two different objects, the object that is seen as farther away will be seen as larger. So you applied two rules and made two inferences. The first rule says see converging lines as further away in the distance in the direction of the convergence. That means the top lines look as if they're further away. The top looks further away. And secondly, Emmert's law that says, which of these is Emmert? I think it's the second one, but you can look it up. Emmert's name is E-M-M-E-R-T. And the second one says if you have two stimuli that make the same impact on your retina, that occupy the same amount of the retinal field, see the one that is seen as further away, see that one as larger. So you got the first rule tells you that this is farther, and the second rule tells you this one is bigger because it's seen as further away. Okay, now I think that can't be right because rule following has to go on in real time and has to be accessible to consciousness. These are not the kind of thing you could become conscious of. What happens, I think, is that you have a visual system that is structured in such a way that it responds to certain sorts of shapes and certain sorts of configurations. This is why you can see perspective in the way that you do. The postulation of the rule is not only unnecessary, but I think it violates what I call a connection principle that says we only understand the postulation of an unconscious mental state to the extent that we understand it as the postulation of something which, though unconscious then and there, could have been conscious. Now let me give you some examples let me give you the examples and then I'll give you the argument for that. I said that I followed the rule, drive on the right-hand side of the road. But there are other rules that would have predicted my behavior just as well. So, for example, if somebody said, well, the rule you're really following is drive so that the steering wheel of the car is nearest to the center line of the road. Stay in a lane where you can get the steering wheel near the center line. Does everybody see that? Given that I'm on two-lane roads and my car steering wheel is on the left, then naturally I will be on the right-hand side because that gets the steering wheel nearest the center line of the road. That will predict my behavior just as well. And scientific methodologists among you will say, well, that's more efficient because that will predict the behavior of people in England as well as the behavior of people in the United States, because the English cars are built differently. They have the steering wheel on the right. The reason I mention this example is when I rented a car in Australia, these car rental people were so used to Americans crashing the car and forgetting to drive on the left that the guy told me, now just drive so the steering wheel is nearest the center line of the road. Just do it that way. Okay, so I tried that, and it occurred to me that's just as good a rule. That's not the rule that I follow. Now the moral of that is any rule has an aspectual shape. It's only under certain aspects that you follow the rule. The behavior is the same. Drive so the steering wheel is near the center, drive on the right. The behavior is the same, but I'm following one of those rules and not another. And this is true of intentionality generally. It's true that I'm thirsty for water, but I could be thirsty for water without being thirsty for H2O if I didn't know that water was H2O. Every intentional state, and consequently every case of rule following, has what I call an aspectual shape, a certain aspect under which the conditions of satisfaction are represented. So you can desire water without desiring H2O, even though water is H2O, because you represent what you want under the aspect of being water and not under the aspect of being H2O. People desired water long before they ever heard of H2O. Okay, now, this is the punchline. You only can get the aspectual shape of an unconscious intentional state if you think of it as the kind of thing which, though not conscious then and there, all the same is the kind of thing that could be conscious. And the reason for that is that when the state is totally unconscious, there is no aspectual shape that is manifest right then and there. When I'm sound asleep, it's true to say of me that I believe that George Washington was the first president of the United States, but that state is totally unconscious. Well, what does it mean to say that I have that unconscious intentional state? What it means is, what fact corresponds to that is, my brain is in a state which is such that if you wake me up, or if I wake up and you ask me the question, who was the first president of the United States, I have a capacity to produce that state in a conscious form. Now, this is the bottom line of the argument about the connection principle. When unconscious, the only things going on in the brain are neurobiological processes. All the same, there are unconscious intentional states in the brain when all that's there is unconscious neurobiological processes. But intentional states must have an aspectual shape. Where's the aspectual shape when the state is totally unconscious? And the answer is, that's a contradiction as I gave it to you. It says the unconscious intentional state must have an aspectual shape. There are no aspectual shapes when the state is totally unconscious. And the resolution of the contradiction is to say, when we ascribe an unconscious intentional state to a person, what we're ascribing is the ability to produce that state with its aspectual shape in a conscious form. Now, the person may be unable to produce it in a conscious form because of brain damage or a repression or some other reason, but it has to be the kind of thing that could be conscious. Okay, now in the text, in the reading that I gave you, I actually spell this out as an actual argument, and it's not many steps, so it might be worthwhile to go over it. There has to be a distinction between real, honest-to-John intentionality and the as-if or the observer, and the as-if or observer relative kind, between me saying I'm thirsty for water and my saying in my car it's thirsty for gasoline. So there's an intrinsic versus as-if. Okay, the second step is the intrinsic intentional states, where you really have the intentional state. That has aspectual shape. Aspectual shape. Those of you who are familiar with the philosophy of language, aspectual shape is what Frege meant by the mode of presentation. If you don't know about Frege, don't worry about it. It's just I'm tying that to what you may have learned in another course. The intrinsic has aspectual shape, and now the crucial step, the unconscious. I'll use the Freudian abbreviation. UCS means unconscious. The unconscious is intrinsic. But then, it's not just observer relative. It's not just observer relative or metaphorical. If I say, even when I'm sound asleep, I believe that George Washington was the first president of the United States. Okay, but now, if the unconscious has aspectual shape, there is no aspectual shape in third-person terms. The ontology of aspectual shape does not permit of analysis in terms of behavior or neurophysiology, because the behavior that goes with seeking water is the same as the behavior that goes with seeking H2O. You have to assume some first-person ontology. But there is no aspectual shape in a third-person ontology. That is where you have a choice between either behavior or neurophysiology. Those are insufficient to give you aspectual shape by themselves. You have to suppose that there's some first-person ontology. Okay, so, but when unconscious, there's no aspectual shape. But now, step 5, when unconscious, there is no first-person ontology. It's all third-person. No first-person ontology. It's all third-person. There's just the neurobiology going on when you're sound asleep. Incidentally, all I'm doing here is repeating what's in the reading, so I'm not too anxious. I'm not too worried about getting it all written on the black course, because it's all in the assigned reading. It's all in the text. Okay, so we have a contradiction here. The contradiction is that the unconscious intentional state has intrinsic aspectual shape, but all that's going on when it's unconscious is a third-person ontology, and there is no aspectual shape at the level of the third-person ontology, at the level of behavior or neurobiology. So what's the solution to the contradiction? And the solution, I don't want to block this out, but I'll write it down. This is step 6, and that is the unconscious is understood as that which is potentially conscious. Unconscious, UCS is potentially CS, but then if that's right, then there's the last step. The ontology of the UCS is neurobiology. I'll just put neurobiology capable of causing consciousness. So you get a connection between the unconscious and the conscious. We understand an unconscious mental state as genuinely mental, insofar as we understand it as the kind of thing that could be conscious. The ontology of the unconscious is a neurobiological state capable of causing consciousness. Let me nail this down to an example. You're sound asleep. You're in a sound, dreamless sleep. All the same, there are lots of things, lots of psychological attributions that are true of you. Even when you're sound asleep, you know that George Washington was the first president of the United States. Now, as always, the tough problem in philosophy is what fact corresponds to that claim. When you're sound asleep, you have this belief. I'll just say it's a belief, so we don't want to worry about whether or not it's true. You have a belief even when you're totally sound asleep and your brain is totally unconscious. It's a dreamless sleep. What fact corresponds to the claim? And what fact corresponds to the claim given that the fact of the attribution of an intentional state must be intrinsic and it must have aspectual shape. When there is no aspectual shape at the level of the unconscious, at the level of behavior and neurobiology. And the answer I'm proposing is you understand an unconscious state as mental insofar as you understand it as the kind of thing that could become conscious, that could cause consciousness. Now, when I published this, as you can imagine, there were howls of outrage. And Chomsky, I did it in behavioral and brain science, where then once you publish this, you got all these incoming missiles. You get another 20 shells aimed at you. Chomsky argued as follows. He said, well, what about the woman who responds unconsciously to the different parts of the image that she's seeing? And I've given you this example before, but I want to apply it here. There's a woman who cannot see on the left side of an object. So you got two identical houses. And the houses, if I drew them right, are supposed to be the same, only this house has flames pouring out of the left-hand side. Now, the woman is incapable of seeing the left-hand side of an object. So you ask her, what about these two houses? Do they look alike? And she says they're absolutely identical. But you then say to her, which house would you rather live in? And she says, I'd much rather live in B. I don't want to live in A. Okay, everybody get the picture here. Now, we can only explain that if we suppose, well, unconsciously, she is aware that this house is on fire, even though she doesn't consciously see any difference. Now, Chomsky thinks that's an objection to the connection principle. It's not an objection at all. It's an illustration. We understand what it means for unconsciously to see that this one is on fire because we understand what it would be for anybody, her or anybody else, to see consciously that it was on fire. It's quite an interesting case. If you ask her to draw a picture of the house of what she sees, she only draws the right-hand side. She draws a picture that looks like this. She can't see this half of the picture. In short, what I want to say is the argument that says, well, here's clearly a case where you have an unconscious intentional state. I agree. It's an unconscious intentional state. There are plenty of unconscious intentional states. But we understand it as an unconscious intentional state on the model of a conscious intentional state. Now, that's desperately important because there was a whole movement in cognitive science that said we're going to postulate unconscious rule following where the rules aren't the kind of thing you could become conscious of. So when you hear an English sentence, this story goes, you do a whole lot of computational processes, and they're not the kind of thing that you could become conscious of. There are large numbers of zeros and ones. You couldn't be conscious of that. Jennifer.
What about the response to that? A lot of your behavior isn't under any special shape whatsoever. You're just in the flow, as they would say. But there's good evidence that some of that behavior is rules
Yeah.
Case in point, I'm going to give you a child's example.
Yeah.
It's language.
Mm-hmm.
But a 5-year-old who by the point of 5 has all the grammar he or she will ever need
Yeah.
isn't aware of the rules that are guiding
Yeah.
and constructing the very sounds that they're making. So
Yes. I want to suggest that a lot of the rules that are postulated are not rules. They're patterns of your behavior which are not rules because they're not the kind of thing you could become conscious of. Yesterday I went skiing and I skied maybe too fast and got too exhausted, so I'm even more groggy today because I drove home yesterday afternoon than I would otherwise be. Now, I did a whole lot of things on the slope that manifested a physical skill of the ability to move on the mountain. How much of it was rule following? Well, maybe some things are rule following. Every so often I tell myself, now, get your weight on a downhill ski. That's a case of consciously following a rule. But there are all sorts of patterns of my behavior that I think are not matters of rule following. Let me give you a linguistic example. Most of you, when you're forming an interrogative sentence, Sally hit the door, you will follow a rule. You will put a WH. Who hit the door? And you can WH the door. But when you WH the door, you have to move it to the front of the sentence. So you will say not Sally hit what. You will say, what did Sally hit? That's called did everybody understand this? That's the WH inversion transformation. Now there's a subtle rule that people say we're all following. It says you can only apply the WH inversion transformation once to any given phrase marker. So you can get what did Sally hit, and you can get who hit the door, but you can't get what hit. Everybody got that? You can't do it twice. Okay, now is that because you're following this rule, unconscious rule? Only apply the WH inversion transformation to once to any given phrase marker. I don't think that's the right way to describe it. Yes?
Okay, so let's take the word rule out, which has interpretation.
Yeah.
And put in something like principle.
Yeah.
Or pattern.
Yeah.
And so even you admit that you might learn through a pattern.
Yes.
Then you become unaware. You're not operating under an aspect, but it seems like the pattern's in operation.
Yes, there are patterns of behavior. What we're interested now is the causal explanation of human cognition. And the model that I am attacking says the right causal explanation of human cognition postulates unconscious rules which the agent is following unconsciously and could not become conscious of. Now, what I want to say as opposed to that is something very much like what you said. There are patterns of your behavior, and your behavior will be responsive to the pattern, but the causal explanation of your behavior is not that you're trying to follow the pattern. Let me give you another example. In a perfectly carved turn, the reverse camber of the ski will be exactly equal to the angle of the turn. If you're not a skier, don't worry about this. It's true. But in any case, I care about this kind of crap. I never met a ski racer who knew that rule or tried to follow it. But if you look at the movies, yeah, that's what everybody's doing. More reverse camber means a tighter turn, and that's what the guys are trying to do in the slalom. I don't think that's a rule they're following unconsciously. I think what they're trying to do is get down the mountain as fast as you can. And if you follow, that is a rule. Everybody's trying to follow. Incidentally, I must have told you this story before. The difference between American ski coaches and Austrian ski coaches is very revealing. All the Americans went to college. They all went to Boulder or Dartmouth or somewhere. So at the end of the course, you ask them, what am I doing wrong? And they'll tell you, your elbows are too low, or you're not moving the foot to foot smoothly enough. Austrians always say the same thing. Go faster, schneller. Yeah, coach, but what about my Ellenbogen? Tell me about my elbow. They don't give a damn about the elbow. Schneller. But anyway, that's why they beat us. Okay, now I want to say, if you follow the rule, go schneller, go faster, which is a rule I strongly recommend, your body will do all sorts of things. But it doesn't follow that you're following those rules. What I'm trying to say is, it's a mistake to think, I lost my line, it's a mistake that the gap is filled by a whole lot of rules that are not only unconscious, but they're the kind of thing you couldn't be conscious of. Lauren had her hand up. Yeah. We still have some time. Yes.
I was going to ask, like, what about something like memory, where we don't, like, all the processes that create our memory are unconscious, but then memory is like a conscious.
Yeah. Well, this is another interesting point, and the point is, how do you remember something? You see, I remember the name of the town I was born in. What do? Do I go through a series of steps unconsciously to come up with Denver, not Colorado Springs, Pueblo, Cheyenne, or other towns to the west? And the temptation is to think, well, you must have followed some unconscious rule. I don't think so. I think I just happen to remember that the town I grew up in is, the town I was born in is Denver, and if you ask me that, I'm able to remember that. Now, there are some interesting things here. Memory gets worse. And I basically, much of this course is good news, but let me give you the bad news. Once you get to be the age of 80, half of you will get Alzheimer's. And Alzheimer's has two traits that are very depressing. One is there's no cure, and secondly is it's invariably fatal. So the government ought to be doing something about this. This is a scandal. I mean, when I was a kid, we were all worried about polio. They solved that. Now I'm getting closer to Alzheimer's. I want to get busy and solve the Alzheimer problem. Okay, we'll go on with this on Thursday, and I'll take up, I promised Jennifer I'll take up her question because I didn't answer it adequately.